I'm Tony Maietta. I'm a Hollywood historian. Let's answer some questions from the internet. This is Old Hollywood Support. St. Francis asks, all right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Where is this iconic line from? It is from a 1950 classic film called Sunset Boulevard, spoken by Gloria Swanson as Norma Desmond, and it's one of the great last lines in movie history. Directed by Billy Wilder, about an aging silent film star who believes she is ready for a comeback. And Mr. DeMille is Cecil B. DeMille, who was a legendary director both in the silent era and throughout classic Hollywood, and he worked frequently with Gloria Swanson. So there's kind of meta moments here with this iconic line, which is probably one of the most famous last lines in cinema history. I hear it all the time. Our Ask Historians asks, how did the US film industry come to be centered in Los Angeles when the film industry came here? It didn't start out in Los Angeles, it started out on the East Coast, in a beautiful little town called West Orange, New Jersey, because that's where Thomas Edison was. Thomas Edison was not only the father of many, many inventions, such as the light bulb and the phonograph, he was also famously litigious, and he patented everything. Now, this wasn't a problem for the larger film companies in New York, such as Biograph. They created their own cameras and they didn't have any need for Edison. But for the smaller independents, they found that they had to pay Edison every time they wanted to use one of his cameras. Well, this could be quite expensive, and they tried to get around it, but Edison had what we'd like to think of as the patents men. They were basically henchmen. And they would find these independents, and they would shoot up their cameras so they couldn't make the movie, or they would beat them up, or it was a real Wild West situation. The best thing to do was to get as far away from Edison as possible. So they went to the very edge of the United States, to California. But when they got to Southern California, they realized, wow, this is even better than East Orange, New Jersey. This is even better than Fort Lee, because we have about 260 days of sunshine, and within a day's travel, you have everything. You have the desert, you have the ocean, you have the mountains, you have the city. I mean, it was an incredible array of things at their disposal. So that's really why the film industry ended up in Los Angeles and in Hollywood. Colette at Burberry Skirt, I like that name, asks, what year do you guys consider to be the beginning of Hollywood's golden age? I was thinking either 1927, the arrival of sound, or 1934, the end of pre-code. Most people agree it's probably about the beginning of the advent of sound, although silent film certainly qualifies for some wonderful golden age films. Up until the end of the studio system, which is sometime in the mid to late 60s, is pretty much the golden age that we think of. But there was also a second golden age, not quite as famous, but just as interesting, that happened after that, from about 68, when the production code was gone, and these incredible filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, like Alan Pakula, were making really groundbreaking films, like The Godfather Saga, like Rosemary's Baby, like What's Up, Doc, with Peter Bogdanovich, all the way up to about Chinatown with Polanski. So that was kind of the second golden age, which ended in about 75. You referenced the end of pre-codes. The pre-code era was about 4 or 5 years, from about 1929 to 1934, in which films were really crazy, lascivious, salacious. Because there was a production code, which was basically a list of do's and don'ts that was created in order to prevent censorship. Hollywood was self-censoring at this time. They didn't want other people, the government certainly, to come in and censor their film. So pre-code really is a misnomer, because there was a code of do's and don'ts and be carefuls and don't do this and don't do that and make sure that kiss isn't longer than 5 seconds. It wasn't enforced until 1934, when the Catholic Church got involved. Priests would tell their congregations from the pulpit, you can go to hell if you watch this film. And that really scared filmmakers. So they finally started paying attention and said, okay, we'll follow the code. A Reddit user asks, do studios in Hollywood still own their actors the same way they did in the 20th century? They sure as hell don't. The studio system ended pretty much in the 60s. Universal held on to some of their contract players throughout the 60s. One of the great things about the studio system was that this was a great training ground for people. People like Lucille Ball, who came to Hollywood as a showgirl and learned her craft while she was getting paid for a studio and then became Lucille Ball. I mean, mean, this was a wonderful, wonderful training ground for these actors and actresses. Yes, it was very constrictive, and yes, you could feel like you were being owned. However, many people kind of wish that system was still around because it was guaranteed employment, if anything. Page Turner 627 asks, was the mid-Atlantic accent really just a made-up accent used by actors? Yes, it was. It wasn't made up by actors, but yeah. There's no such thing as a mid-Atlantic accent. There had to be a standardization of speech in order for people, the audiences, to understand actors. And remember, sound was brand new. Talkies were brand new, so they needed every break they could get. Mid-Atlantic really is a mixture of East Coast upper class dialects, Atlantic Coast, that's where the Mid-Atlantic comes from, and stage talk, stage speech, if you will. It's kind of that blend. And that's why actors and actresses in films from the 30s and 40s and up until the 50s don't talk like anybody else. They don't talk like us. By the 50s, when films were becoming a little more real, there was a realism movement after the war, mostly from foreign films. You didn't see that as much. The mid-Atlantic accent kind of died away. At Big Thugga asks this, what is so legendary about Marilyn Monroe? Not even being funny. Was she really a good actress? Marilyn, one of the most iconic actresses in the history of cinema. Here's the thing about Marilyn. Marilyn had what one of her directors, Billy Wilder, called flesh impact. And what he meant by that was the effect of seeing Marilyn on screen to audiences was visceral. You could feel her. She had that kind of force. And all you gotta do is watch some of her films, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire. You get that. Your eye goes immediately to her. You cannot look at anybody else when Marilyn Monroe's on screen. Marilyn was a natural comedian. Watch Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Watch How to Marry a Millionaire. She's very funny, but it's not overdone. She's very subtle. When she was the biggest star in the world, she stopped for a year and went to New York and joined the Actors Studio and took classes on how to become a really good actress from Lee Strasberg. Now, this is unheard of. She was already a huge star, but she stopped because she wanted to get better. And she did. Some of her later performances, particularly in The Prince and the Showgirl with Sir Laurence Olivier, who was no slouch, she pretty much wipes him off the screen. She was sublime. Unfortunately, she died at age 36, so we never really had the opportunity to find out what her later career would have been like. But I have no doubt that she would have been one of the greatest stars. At Ahagawa, asks, my roommate told me she doesn't know who Elizabeth Taylor is, and I almost had a stroke. Elizabeth Taylor! The biggest star of the 50s and 60s. I mean, Taylor and Burton, not ringing a bell for you? Okay. They call Elizabeth Taylor the last movie star because she was one of the last of the generation that was completely, totally raised at a studio. She began working in films as a very young child, all up until almost to her death. I mean, she was trained by the studio, mostly MGM. She was certainly one of the most beautiful women in the world. She famously had violet eyes. She and her husband, Richard Burton, who she married twice, were probably they weren't the first celebrity couple, but they were one of the biggest celebrity couples in the 60s. They met on the set of Cleopatra when she was married to someone else, and there was a scandal. The Vatican condemned her. She was a brilliant actress. She won 2 Academy Awards. Download Elizabeth Taylor, because you're going to be stunned at some of the things she does and how beautiful this woman really was. And what a great humanitarian she was. Elizabeth Taylor said the word AIDS before anybody else would because she had so many friends who were dying. So we owe a great debt to Elizabeth Taylor for that alone. Istobri asks, what caused the decline of the classic Hollywood musical film? 1930s to 1940s era. Musicals were very expensive to make. You not only had to pay actors, you had to pay musicians, you had to pay songwriters, you had to pay choreographers. There were a lot of people on the musical payroll. Second of all, after the war, the mood in the country shifted. There was a sense of innocence about musicals because you have to suspend your disbelief. Because I mean, when you think about it, how many times have you seen in your daily life somebody having a normal conversation and then suddenly bursting into song or suddenly dancing around the room? It doesn't happen that often. After the war, people got a lot more cynical. There was a great realism movement in films after the wars. But beyond that, in the 1950s, there was this little invention called television, which began peeling away movie audiences by the millions. Movie studios had to start divesting themselves of this great pool of talent that they had under contract. So they didn't have this pool of talent at the ready cheaply to make these musicals, which were incredibly expensive. At Himadosh14141 asks, so question for film oofies. Why is Gone with the Wind still considered a classic despite everything? They're talking about the attitude of the filmmakers towards a very shameful time in our history, slavery, and the Civil War. Here's the thing about Gone with the Wind. It's an incredibly made film. It was a technical feat when it came out. It stunned everyone and blew everyone away by its scope, by its size, by its grandeur, by its subject matter. It is difficult for audiences to watch today, but it is still a huge achievement in filmmaking. You have to put yourself in the mindset, perhaps, of 1939, 1940, when these attitudes were much different than they are today, and then hopefully you can enjoy the film for what it is. Previous Stick asks, does anyone have any salacious, scandalous, shocking tea about old Hollywood stars? Let's see, Clark Gable was alleged to be a gay hustler in Los Angeles early in his career and actually hooked up with George Cukor, who later directed him for a time in Gone with the Wind. Oh, Loretta Young. Loretta Young's great. So Loretta Young was a very, very famous actress in the golden age. And she was also very, very Catholic, okay? But she was on a film opposite Clark Gable, her co-star, and they had an affair. The film was called Call of the Wild. And at the end of the affair, Loretta Young became very, very pregnant. Well, what are you gonna do? Clark Gable was married. There was no possibility of getting married. So Loretta Young left Hollywood for a few months, had her baby, put the baby in an orphanage, came back to Hollywood, waited a few more months, and then adopted that baby, named her Judy, and raised her as her adopted child for the rest of her life. As Judy got older, she started to look more and more like Clark Gable and Loretta Young, to the point where she had the Gable ears that her mother had to have pinned back. So eventually, after hearing these rumors her entire life, Judy Lewis confronted her mother near the end of her mother's life and asked her if it was true. And finally, Loretta confessed, yes, it is true. You are a walking mortal sin, Loretta Young. Purple Leonora asks, when was the first Academy Awards ceremony held? The first Academy Awards were held in May of 1929, and they were held at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. The tickets cost $5, and the ceremony was 15 minutes long. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences developed this award as kind of like, oh, and let's give this award out every year. They really started to gain steam in the late 30s and into the 40s. Once television came in and they started to be televised in the 50s, they truly became the appointment television that we think of today. Why is this called an Oscar? It's one of these legends that no one's really sure what the real truth is. My favorite story, and the legend that I like the best, is that it was named by Bette Davis, because the backside of Oscar reminded Bette Davis of her first husband, Oscar Nelson. And she allegedly said, that's an Oscar. That may not be true, but it's my favorite story. MacMac360 asks, what happened the night Natalie Wood died? There is a lot of speculation. It happened Thanksgiving weekend in 1981 on a boat called the Splendor, which was Natalie Wood and R.J. Wagner's boat, named after Splendor in the Grass, one of Natalie Wood's great films. She and R.J. Wagner, Robert Wagner, and Christopher Walken went out to Catalina for a very cold and very wet Thanksgiving weekend. And Natalie Wood ended up Sunday morning floating in Catalina Harbor. No one really knows what happened. The theory that is most accepted, and I think makes the most sense, is that the dinghy was attached to the side of the boat and it was banging and it was keeping her awake. And her husband and Christopher Walken were up above having drinks and she was in the bedroom, so she went outside in her nightgown and parka and socks to retie the dinghy, slipped on the step, hit her head, and fell in the water. And unfortunately, because her parka filled with water and kept her weight down, she couldn't get back up into the boat. And that's usually what people cite as the cause of death, was the fact that she drowned. Dalmits_Andy asks, were there gay bisexual stars in the 50s and 60s? Yes. There have always been gay and bisexual stars. The difference is that they weren't out. You couldn't be out in the 50s and 60s. You could be arrested for being gay or bisexual and acting on it in the 50s and 60s. You could be thrown into a mental hospital. You could get a lobotomy. Lots of horrible things. Some of the ones who were a little more honest about who they were Farley Granger. To a certain extent, Montgomery Clift. Certainly, he wasn't out, but we know now, certainly Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter. They were afraid that if the public knew that a star was gay, that suddenly he wouldn't have the romantic appeal. But if you watch some films of that era, such as Pillow Talk, there's some wonderful little sly allusions to the real sexuality of Rock Hudson, because everybody knew in the film industry. They just didn't know in Peoria. They just didn't know, in Des Moines. It's a struggle. It's still a struggle. There's a lot more gay actors in Hollywood than are out gay actors in Hollywood. But we're making progress. Slowly but surely. The Pixel Paint asks, why was it so hard for so many actors to make the transition from silent films to the talkies? Was it just a matter of voiced acting being more difficult, or were there other factors at play? Silent film is a completely different art than talking film. I think that's what people don't realize. They think silent films were just films without talking. No, they were an entirely different art form. A lot of actors in Hollywood, particularly big silent film stars, had very heavy accents. Didn't matter because you weren't talking. So there were some great silent film stars who just left. They weren't even going to try to learn how to speak this mangled new mid-Atlantic accent. Also, a big factor was the fact that many silent film stars their personas didn't match their voice. This happened primarily with an actor named John Gilbert, who was probably the most famous victim of talkies. He was the He-Man, he was romantic, and he kind of had a light tenor voice. It didn't match. So that was really one of the big problems, was the persona didn't necessarily match the voice. There was also a shift in the culture at this time. Don't forget, not only was there a shift in Hollywood with sound into talkies, but the Depression happened. Wall Street fell. Suddenly, the kind of heroes that were in silent film were not really relevant in this tough new world we were in. Baron Destructo asks, how many cigarettes per day was 16-year-old Judy Garland encouraged to smoke in order to keep her weight down during the filming of The Wizard of Oz in 1939. I wish it was only cigarettes. Smoking was just what sophisticated adults did. So MGM had no hand in Judy Garland's cigarette habit. However, they had a big hand in her drug addiction. They did encourage her to take pills. Amphetamines. An easy way to lose weight back in the day was to take amphetamines. The problem with amphetamines was that it hyped her up. And so she couldn't sleep at night. So they then had to give her sleeping pills to get her to sleep because she had to be up at 5 a.m. and sparkle, Judy, sparkle. It became a very, very, very bad habit. One thing fed the other. Now, MGM and all the studios didn't just do this with Judy Garland. They did it with a lot of stars. At Kelbodan asks, Shirley Temple is a real person. Thought it was just a drink. Yes, Shirley Temple was a real person. She was the biggest box office star in the world for 4 years, beginning when she was 6 years old. She saved 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy because this was the Depression. So this little girl, all of 6 years old, held a studio on her back. She was later an ambassador in the 80s. So she had quite a career, and the drink was indeed named after her because it has no alcohol, and she was a child. Blue Jester 12 asks, when did the old Hollywood system go away? I would probably say in the late 60s, because what happened was that the studios were forced by the Supreme Court to divest themselves of their theater chains. Now, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, studios owned theaters. That was really the point for many of these moguls, was they really were more in the real estate business. They had more theaters, and then they created these studios to put product into these theaters. So there were Paramount theaters, there were Warner Brothers theaters, MGM had Lowe's. It was decided that this was a monopoly. It's called vertical integration. And the studios were forced to divest themselves of their theater chains. So they lost an outlet for their product. They had to drastically cut back on staff, drastically cut back on the number of films they could make. And there was this little thing happening about the same time called television, which was also eating away at their audience. And by the 60s, many studios just couldn't survive as they had during the golden age. So they had to let go of their contract players, they had to let go of their contract writers, all these people who were under contract. When the studio system really died down, I think is what most people think of as the end of old Hollywood, the end of the studio system. Brandon Ma I asks, worst thing about film school was having to sit through boring-ass black and white movies. It's a knife in my heart. But no, I'm glad you asked this, because all I can tell you is that watch a film from 1933 called Babyface, which is one of these pre-code films in black and white. And I guarantee you there ain't nothing boring ass about it. It is one of the most salacious, lascivious. Barbara Stanwyck plays a woman who literally fucks her way to the top. It's unfortunate that because these films are not presented in a way that we're used to, that they get this reputation of being boring. You just have to realize it was a different time, and it might seem a little slow to us in our instant gratification world, but sit with it for a while, I guarantee you. It'll get interesting. A Reddit user asks, what movies were the first in their genres? The real trendsetters of filmmaking. When you think about screwball comedies, probably the first screwball comedy, one of the most famous, is It Happened One Night, starring Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. They both won Oscars for it. That was definitely the first screwball comedy. It started the entire screwball comedy genre. Musicals have been around since talkies. The Broadway Melody of 1929 was not the first musical, but it's probably one of the very first and one of the most famous. It won the Academy Award. It was the first musical to do that. I mean, there were films in the silent era that you could term horror films. The big one, the one that really set the horror genre in motion, was Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. It was a tremendous hit in the early 30s and started this whole cycle of horror films from Universal Studios mostly, such as Frankenstein, such as The Bride of Frankenstein, such as The Invisible Man. So you can really point to Dracula as being probably the very first of those. There was a silent film star named Harold Lloyd, who was one of the big three: Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd, the big three comic superstars in silent film. Harold Lloyd did romantic comedies. We don't think of romantic comedies necessarily in silent film, but he really was a romantic comedy star of his era. Gangster films were big in the 1930s because of the Depression, because of the fact that people were so desperate and they wanted to see people, giving the finger to this government and this society which put us in such dire straits. Someone from Quora asks, in what major ways did Charlie Chaplin impact cinema? Aside from the fact that he was probably the biggest star in the world during the silent era, his impact as a filmmaker can be felt. He was singular in the fact that for the majority of his great career was his own boss. He had his own studio. He financed his own films. He wrote his own scripts. He cast his films. Charlie Chaplin was a force in Hollywood. He was a force in filmmaking. And Charlie Chaplin was also the last star to leave silent film and go into talkies. When you're talking about titans of film history, Charlie Chaplin is right up there at the top. One of the amazing things about Chaplin, too, if you ever watch a Chaplin film, is Chaplin had such incredible control over his body. He was such an athlete. He did his own stunts. So did Douglas Fairbanks. These people did their own stunts. There was no CGI. There was no manipulation of the camera. What you see up there, he actually did. Same thing with Buster Keaton, another great athlete, silent comic, one of the big three. These people all did their own stunts. Many of them directed their own films, wrote their own films. They were true auteurs before the word auteur ever came to existence. At Radseed asks, did silent film stars really bother learning their lines? There weren't scripts in silent films, there were scenarios. And very frequently, especially when you're talking about some of the greats like Chaplin and like Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton, they created as they went along. So when you see a silent film and you see actors mouthing words, yes, they're kind of getting the general idea of what the scene is trying to convey, but it's not like they had to memorize lines. There's a very famous story about a silent film star who would actually curse while they were filming because he didn't think anybody would notice. Well, there happened to be lip readers in the audience who could see exactly what he was saying. You'll see a stray son of a bitch, or you'll see a stray, what the hell are you doing here? At Ori111 asks, why everyone's so obsessed with Citizen Kane? Why not Citizen Ori? Citizen Kane is kind of universally accepted as the greatest film of all time. It's kind of a David and Goliath situation between Orson Welles and William Randolph Hearst. Citizen Kane is remarkable for many reasons. The technology in particular. The cinematographer Greg Toland created something called deep focus, which had never been done before. And basically what that means is the foreground, the middle ground, and the background are all in sharp focus. You know, the fact that the moguls got together on the behest of William Randolph Hearst and tried to stop the film, tried to squash it. And so there's a real rebellious spirit behind Citizen Kane, which I think people admire. I think people certainly admire the genius that was Orson Welles. This film, though it's heralded as a great achievement, was not a big hit when it was released because it rarely played anywhere because there were so many people against it. So it's certainly grown in stature, and as I said, many people consider it the greatest film of all time. Those are all the questions. Thanks for watching Old Hollywood Support.